Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com. Hello and welcome again to the Elixir podcast. Today we're talking to Tim, who's in South Africa, in Cape Town, I believe. Is that right, Tim?
That's right.
It's lovely to have you here. Would you like to tell us which poem you'd like to read us?
Thank you. It's lovely to be on and lovely to be asked about this because it's a poem that means a lot to me. It's Ozymandias by Shelley, and it's a poem that I've known for years and years, for decades, frankly. I mean, it hit me as a teenager, and in the finest tradition of the best writing, whether it's prose or poetry, it is a brainworm. It gets in my brain and it stays there and occasionally recurs. Ozymandias by Shelley.
Wonderful.
Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. No thing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Well, that's incredibly moving, Tim. And actually, wouldn't it be great if some of our great leaders had read this poem? You know, some of the people around the world.
Isn't that frankly what this is all about? It's about appreciating that all humans have an ultimate modesty about them. We are but to return to dust, and the anger and the arrogance and hubris that goes with leadership. This is written at a time when there are tyrants, genuine tyrants, terrorizing a world. It's written in the 18 teens. Napoleon is alive and well. He's in jail, of course, but this is a world teetering on the edge. And in a way, Shelley, who is a radical poet, and we know this because already one of the poems on the podcast has come up and teased up one of his more radical elements, where he wrote about the Mask of Anarchy and dared to touch on the behavior of the British yeomanry, the British militia, effectively killing innocent people at the Peterloo massacre. Here's a radical who is holding up a mirror to tyrants, yes, and to say, ultimately you're going to end up as, anything you build today is a vanity project, which will end up in death. But really, isn't that all of us? I mean, don't we all, if we ever give in to hubris and arrogance, aren't we ultimately going to be earthed? Aren't we ultimately going to lose it? And that's why it's so powerful. It's not just about leaders. I mean, look at those words. Aren't those words great? He's describing this statue, the wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. I mean, have you not seen that on Donald Trump, the wrinkled lip, or Boris Johnson, or in his day, Winston Churchill, or Stalin, or those are the tyrants, but also people we know. That guy in the pub who gobs off too much, that bully in the school playground that we were upset by when we were a child, we couldn't stand up to them. Those bullies will ultimately be grounded. And that, for me, is what this is about. I'm from Cape Town, as you say. I'm based in Cape Town. And the word Ozymandias is bandied around, was recently bandied around to describe Colonel Gaddafi. He used to arrogantly call himself, I'm the King of Kings, the leader of Africa. And there was a
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
When with his oil wealth, he would come. He came to Durban once, a city in South Africa, and he famously drove. He said, I shall drive the length of Africa to show that I'm the King of Kings. Well, he got about 2 countries up. He went to Mozambique. But what he would do was throw dollar bills out of the window. Could you imagine the intoxicating effect of throwing dollar bills out into an area of rural poverty. And of course, that gives the image of greatness. Well, where is Gaddafi? He was shot like a sewer rat in a pipe when the people turned against him. So his statue breaks, his statue collapses in the desert. So I just think it's a wonderfully grounding poem. Ozymandias, it has a nice little backstory. It was written as a competition at Christmas. Shelley and a poet mate of his used to challenge each other over Christmas who can come up with a decent poem, and they challenged themselves just with the one word Ozymandias. The name of it was it's slightly freighted with classicism. It means something. It's a Greek word for pharaoh, but you don't need to know that. I didn't have to Google that. That's not important. It has a certain heft to it. But what I love about this poem is that it is that heft dissipates. We can all get it. And also at the same time, there's a it makes you think like a good brainworm. It kind of tantalizes you. There's a line in here, 2 lines, and I challenge your listeners. What do you make of this? Can I read them again to you? Tell that its sculpture well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. So it's telling us that the sculptor knew the nasty arrogance of the tyrant, and he puts them into the lifeless things, into the stone. But what does that line mean? The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. Is that the subject, the topic, the tyrant? Is he doing the mocking, or is the sculptor using his hand to mock them? And is he using his artistic heart to live off this life force? So, like, again, one element of beautiful poetry is that it's not all clear. It is slightly ambiguous. It is a little bit challenging and tantalizing. And I've been reading that for years, for decades. I can't honestly say I've got full triangulation on that and full understanding. But so what? And that's why poetry is so good. It stays with you. And there's that lovely line from Conrad, Joseph Conrad, who said the best writing is like the best music. You leave a concert and some refrains come back to you immediately, an hour later, a week later, a lifetime later. For me, this poem, Ozymandias, comes back to me.
And when you read something over again over a long period of time, it comes to mean other things,
I agree. I read this with a friend recently, and he pointed out, the emphasis here is, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So this is you could say this is a tyrant arrogantly, haughtily talking to another tyrant. Well, I wonder, he's saying, well, come on. The whole point about this is the despair is in us, in all of us. It's not just a tyrant. It's us. It's humanity. We ultimately, we think we're in control of life when really we're on a river and we know not where it takes us.
And we're not in control of our accolades either. If you've got a sculptor who has been employed to make you look fantastic, but actually has got a mind of their own and is going to tell more of your truth than you're happy with.
Exactly. Well, there you go. There in that one sentence, you observed another reading of it and another way to say, well, the sculptor is empowered here. We have 4 topics. We have a person who's telling you the poem. We have a traveler who's telling you the story. He's describing a sculptor, and the sculptor's describing. So lots of dimensions to it. It is a sonnet form. It's 14 lines. There's a lot in here. And of course, in our world, in our recent history, we have had desert kingdoms fighting desert regimes. Saddam Hussein, I remember, Saddam Hussein famously rebuilt the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, printing his own name on every single brick. And is that not does that not ring a bell? And then we segue to Afghanistan, and we think, the empty vasts of Helmand and the dust and the killing and the chaos left behind, and an American helicopter left, maybe at Abbottabad, for example, where they killed Osama bin Laden. Is that not 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone? Isn't that something that represents something supposedly so strong and eternal as American superpower? Well, it's just a broken helicopter on the ground, or an abandoned Bagram military base, or stretching the metaphor here. But the point is, this poem, written in the early 19th century, works for me. And it works in the 21st. It might work in terms of realpolitik or current affairs, but also about life,
it's just that also very human urge to leave something of oneself, and some sign that you've passed through the world, which was magnified after we started writing and creating different types of art, I guess. But that's a very human urge to leave some type of tracery of yourself in the world. Whether or not you're a tyrant.
Isn't Elixir, isn't that part of
Exactly.
that human thing? The desire to the alchemy of creating something that will give you an elixir of life that you will never age, and yet we do.
Yeah.
And it's Peter Pan, a kid's story, and yet it is a beautifully powerful metaphor. We have to grow up. We leave Peter Pan on his island because not growing up is not to be human, and we aren't eternal. And the filter of this poem reminds me, and the hubris of our politicians, whether it's an arrogant Tory prime minister who's been in power and gives PPE contracts to his mates, or an American politician, or whatever. Don't need to apply it specifically. In Africa, I've got Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo, one of these iconic figures. It's not really just about them. It's Ozymandias as a poem for me reminds us that don't be so vain as to think that we can control. Enjoy what you have, enjoy it the time, because others will. How you are seen will be filtered by others, and will be ultimately turned to dust by time.
I really like the fact that you've chosen this poem, actually, Tim, because I feel that in Western culture we've come to a point where we almost pretend that we're not mortal, and that we're very bad at facing up to our mortality. And there was this philosopher I used to teach called Unamuno, who said that our attitude to our life is absolutely patterned by our attitude to death, and that unless we understand our mortality and face it, we cannot know how to go forward in life. And I think a lot of these leaders, people like Trump, people like Saddam Hussein, they genuinely believe that they are sort of immortal, and that colours the way that they work, the way that they approach the world.
I totally agree. I think that's there's almost an immodesty that comes with being a leader, and reconciling with death is it's spiritually, it's part of great monotheisms, it's part of the great sophistications. You have to accept that the river flows. We enjoy our ride on the river, but it will carry on flowing after we've gone. And the rivers are exciting. The passage of time is exciting, but we only have that brief moment. And I guess people, aren't there sort of people now, somewhere in California where they're working on some methodology of keeping people alive forever? Isn't that the ultimate hubris, frankly?
But also that idea that actually we're completely flawed by our need for individuality. If we realise that we're not someone, that we're not just ourselves, and we're not, we're not individual. We are part of something much greater than ourselves the entire time. I think everything would be so different.
And I believe I agree. And the power of us comes from contributing to that, not from this individual thing. One thinks of, I don't know, Bill Gates, squillionaire, and he's desperately trying to get rid of that wealth now through his mega philanthropy. And some may be correctly, some might be badly guided, but some might be well thought out. But in a way, he's already worked out that if he was just to stay on the trajectory that he was on, he was going to end up like Ozymandias. He's just going to be a shattered visage lying in the desert. And he's decided, oh my gosh, I've got to offload. And I find that very intriguing, because it reminds us, because we're all such on a treadmill with our legs flapping to try and put bread on our table and a roof over our heads, etc., and pay the mortgage. If you do get through that to this level of thing, you're actually very discomforted, because you need to accommodate. So,
but also you're trapped in it, Tim. Jeff Bezos's ex-wife is trying to do exactly the same, and she gave away lots and lots of money week by week as soon as she was divorced. And at the end of the first 6 months, she was richer than she was when she first started that exercise, because once you have that level of wealth, it just keeps increasing. You can't get a shot of it.
Indeed it is. But if I could just mention the Mask of Anarchy. This is a poet who is a radical, now categorized as a radical, wasn't really recognized in his own lifetime. But that poem that we heard the other day, which Corbyn is using in that to his constituents, and as the last stanza of that is used by Jeremy Corbyn to rouse his electorate, and it speaks to them. He writes that in the 18 teens, but it's not published in his lifetime. It was too sensitive because he dared to take on those responsible for the Peterloo Massacre. It would be, I think, 10 or 15 years posthumously, published posthumously, before it could come out. Here, the radical poet is actually daring to say tyrants, whether it be, Napoleon, who is an identified tyrant for the British community from which he comes. Well, hold on. What about a King George? What about the tyrants who the Americans had fought against? And he's daring to point that out. And I find it's a very sophisticated piece of writing by a poet who has this ability, in that Conradian way, to come up with some words that stay with you. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. I wonder how many times have you read that in a Financial Times editorial or heard it on a documentary? And they just keep being used because they're not a cliche. That's the wrong word. They're just of great resonance.
Yes, they're speaking some sort of universal truth, and it's lovely that poetry can do that, and that people can carry just a couplet actually in their minds and in their hearts.
Isn't that the power of poetry? Isn't that what Elixir is all about? The fact that it need only be a few words, but in the right order, as Spike Milligan would say. It's not a case of getting the words, putting them all in the right order. In the right order, with the right power, they do stay. They do worm into our brains. They do challenge us.
So is that your line that stays with you? Is that the line that stays with you? Look on my works, you mighty, and despair, or
probably not. Probably not. Actually, I mean, yes, it's because that I've read it, or heard it. To be honest, cards on the table. I'm a journalist. I've probably used it over the years, but I don't know. For me, the line is whose a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Isn't that perfect? The sneer of cold. Is that Hitler in the bunker? Is that Stalin? Is that Mao? Is that
Putin?
Julius Augustus? Is that Nebuchadnezzar? Is whatever? I mean, these people who I am so in control. I sneer at you. Yeah. You, my underlings, you will do. I am the king of kings. You will bend to me, and I find that you will bend to me, and I find that stays with me. The sneer of the wrinkled lip, and of course, in this week when we're thinking about Donald Trump's ear, the wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command seems very apposite.
So, Tim, can I just ask you've mentioned here to us that you're a journalist. Is that sneer what drove you to be a reporter, to try and understand these people who seem to regulate and control our world?
I think the sneer is a very important part of it, yes, but I think it would probably come. My absolute drive was not knowing and wanting to know, being curious about the world, wondering what's over the horizon, and wanting to know. That's where my journalistic passion comes from. Appreciating that there isn't an absolute truth, but there is a verifiable truth, and we can hold verifiable facts and triangulated certainty. You can hold leaders to account. That's the primary. But then the next thing, because in my time, I've come across Slobodan Milosevic. I've cowered in Bosnian bunkers when his militia are firing, and I'm looking around at these terrified Bosnian Muslim women in Mostar in a bunker, unwashed and degraded and upset for themselves because they don't have enough food for their children or soap for themselves or access to water. And I'm thinking about Milosevic, thinking about him in Belgrade and the sneer of cold command, and Saddam Hussein, and one after the other. Because as the type of journalist I was the one that went to kind of awkward places at awkward times. I mean, the grandiose would call it war correspondent, but I prefer awkward places at awkward times, rich times, interesting times, and we're talking a time of Gaza. We're talking now currently, and if I see the visage of Benjamin Netanyahu, I see a frown, I see a wrinkled lip, and I see a sneer of cold command. He's ordering soldiers to do things in his, not name, in his interpretation of what the name of Israel is. And it's leading to where it's leading. And I find that, Netanyahu will go the way of all Israeli political flesh. He will be kicked out. He will be thrown away. He may well be jailed, whether it's for fraud or for internally or war crimes externally. But he will go. He will end up as the two vast and trunkless legs of stone will. So yeah, I think you're right. Thank you for pointing that out. That this is one of the motivations as a journalist to take on these people and to question that sneer.
Yeah. Tim, it's been so interesting listening to your take on this poem. I would really love it now if you could read it one more time so that our listeners can hear it in the context of how you have experienced that poem during your life. Could you read it one more time to us?
Of course, thank you. And thank you for your engagement. It's a lovely topic, and poetry is one of the great human beauties, something that we can, as we said, we carry it with us in our souls. Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. No thing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away.
That was really wonderful, and you've read it really well. And I've only just realised the incredible comedy, actually, in this, of Ozymandias saying, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair.
Because he's asking them to despair because they are going to be intimidated. But actually, the comedy is, of course, that he's completely 180 degrees getting that despair usage wrong. You're not despairing because you're intimidated. You're despairing because it's hopeless, because it's so pathetic. Or pathetic even. It's so pathetic that this vanity is there. And again, I mean, it's so beautiful that you, as someone engaged, you can hear that, and something, a coin drops. It doesn't drop all the way to the bottom because there's never a bottom of the poem. It keeps on going.
Yeah.
Another coin droppage, another. Oh, what does that mean? And if I could I find it, the best poetry has that ability to just, every time you hear it, it might just dislodge a little coin. Go, oh, maybe that's the way it's meant.
Absolutely. Tim, thank you so much for coming on our podcast. We really appreciate it. And for our listeners, you will be able to access the text of Ozymandias and some information about Tim on my website and through the link in the podcast, helenwing.com. Thank you again for listening to the Elixir podcast. If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. If you'd like to support the production costs of our Elixir Poetry podcast, please feel free to buy me a coffee. Thanks for listening.